Welcome to this conversation with Openended Design. We speak with activists and creators from around the world about design, technology, and culture, unpacking their work, generating new ideas, and exploring their dreams for the future. Diana Campbell is a curator committed to fostering a transnational art world. She's the founding artistic director of the Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh and the BellasArtes projects in the Philippines. What's incredibly cool for me is that she's going to be curating Desert X in Palm Springs next year. Its fourth edition in the Coachella Valley is in March 2023. Diana was educated at Princeton and set off on a very New York-centric career that very quickly veered off into her becoming a channel for the work and concerns of underrepresented regions and artists. In the words of her own bio, her expertise is working with socially engaged artistic practices. In doing this all over the world, she's found herself exploring versions of her own past, family, and identity through her work. But that was clearly never the goal or the outcome. What I love about this conversation is that for all that I've known of Diana over many years now, rigorous, focused, and with a burning intensity and quickness, she's soft, introspective, and sometimes vulnerable as we speak. Her openness made this conversation deeper and more thought-provoking than either of us expected, and it took us from being culture world contemporaries to a higher level of friendship. Thanks, Diana. So, Diana, welcome to this open-ended conversation. You are amazing. You're a curator, a writer, a journalist, and I don't know how else you would describe yourself, but I've actually spent the last couple of days listening to some of your podcasts, watching some of your videos, and I thought I knew about your work, but actually it is so much more expansive than I could have imagined. And I wonder if we could start a little bit with just a story of, how you ended up being where you are. Nobody chooses this path of work, and I think for me, you've really charted your own course, but also set a new framework for what a contemporary curator can be and should be.
Sure. And I think, something that I really love about the title of your platform is this open-ended design. And I think open-endedness is something that I've always looked for in life. Like, if I ever feel like I'm trapped in a box, I'm probably going to freak out and run away. Or if I see where the end is, I probably am not interested anymore and I will probably lose interest. So open-endedness, like for better or for worse, is something that really drives me. And I think that also comes into this story about my career, which actually I don't think I really even knew what a curator was when I was in university. I mean, I grew up going to museums. I loved art. I worked in an art museum. Again, I worked at the Princeton Art Museum when I was there. But like this thought of like a curator as a career path was not something I really thought about. Because like you go to Princeton to be a banker or a politician or a consultant. Like, we're trained in a particular way. And before I went to university, I actually didn't want to go to university. I wanted to be a dancer. So I trained very, very seriously in classical ballet. So for me to go to university was like a failure. It wasn't, I mean, for my parents, they were thrilled, but like, it wasn't the path that I was really looking for. And my parents really wanted me to kind of take that hyper-competitive all-American path of, you like art, make money, buy art. So my first job, I worked at JP Morgan in equity research. But because Sotheby's was such a small company, relative to what the kind of valuations that JP Morgan was looking at, they were like, why don't you take this on?
And so you grew up in the US, and did you ever, had you a sense that you might move to another country?
Not at all. Not at all. So like, you can imagine like on paper, this looked like the absolute picture perfect life, right? Like living in New York City, young, successful, having fun. Like, it really looked like that kind of life that you're supposed to have. And like now looking back at, or when I say open-endedness, that's like a life I can't even connect to. So I actually don't even go back to the US that often anymore because I feel alien. So there's a character that kind of goes through all of this, like, so from that university time until India, who was someone who was my best friend, who we fell very much in love. And he was Indian by blood, but not by birth. He grew up in New York. He went to Princeton with me. He worked in finance in New York. He led that kind of life. But, a show could have been modeled off of him. And I'm so grateful that we had that because, my entire worldview changed. We traveled all over India, and I learned that India is not this one, homogenous country that we see in like American renditions of it. It's actually this collage of fascinating cultures and traditions that are all so different, and languages that are all so different, things that I'd never heard about, or even, it was just not in my field of sight. So anyway, increasingly, I really fell in love with India, but kind of fell out of love with this kind of toxic power struggle, which didn't make either of us our best selves. And there were struggles that I had never heard about before, but I started to understand them through artists. So like looking at work of someone like Amar Kanwar, who's looking at the rights of minors and indigenous people whose livelihoods and very form of existence are being threatened, are being killed sometimes by mining companies, and then to like be living in a household with someone who like makes their money off of mining companies. It was just this kind of I realized I couldn't understand the world through what I read in the news or what that dominant framework is. Artists are able to show things that maybe are not going to be in a newspaper because it's not safe. And again, artists like Amar Kanwar really take care of the people that they work with. But I also realized, because my mother, my maternal family, they come from Guam, which is a small island near the Philippines. And they're an indigenous culture. They're called Chamorros. And our family's land is a runway for a U.S. military base. I mean, it's not literally the runway, but our lands are occupied by the U.S. military. And I also started to realize that actually me and my family's history had more in common with, these indigenous communities in India, or later I found out Bangladesh, than they did with kind of the elite that I was surrounded by. And I started to understand my own history and my own complexities by being totally lost in India. And then later this became more clear in Bangladesh. But maybe the end of all of this is like, I found my voice and the voice of others through artists. And I think what I love about art and artists is that the world doesn't have to be how it is. It's this space of imagination where other things are possible, which I also see with design. And like another thing that I love, for example, is that so my ex and I would watch Three Idiots, right? And then later, the last Dhaka Art Summit, Sonam Wangchuk, who's the engineer that inspired that movie, was a part of the Dhaka Art Summit. So I also think that just living life with full intention and curiosity, and also with values, like you can carry those forward and create something really meaningful.
I wonder, as you were talking, there's obviously something there. There's something about like the story of your life and your inheritance. You said that your mother's family's from Guam, and you did grow up with this knowledge of them growing up in essentially a completely occupied territory, and with the shadow of imperialism and colonialism. And I wonder how much that triggered what you were feeling in this very privileged home, because maybe it would not have had that kind of emotional pull on you if you didn't have something sitting within you that caused you to listen more closely to these artists like Amar Kanwar and whoever else.
You also start to just understand this kind of deeply embedded racism, or what's the other word? A lack of understanding that maybe a small place can be expansive. So for example, Guam is part of an island chain called Micronesia, but actually, so that means small, but they didn't give themselves that name, right? But if you look at them relative to the Great Ocean, it's one of the biggest places that can be. Or like Guam also has the tallest mountain. Technically, I mean, I'm sure it's contested, but they say they have the tallest mountain because it goes deepest in the sea, because it's the Marianas Trench. So for me, it's like, and that's, I think, also why I connect to Bangladesh, is that there's other ways of telling the story. You might completely discount something, like this mountain looks like a hill, but actually if you just change the way you look at it, it can have significance. And my great-grandmother was a subject of Spain, Japan, and the US all within her lifetime. So that also means that this little, mountain hill is geopolitically extremely important if you have so many people vying after it. Yet there's a reason why people don't want you to know what it is. So I think that's also, looking with artists, they look at things in a different way. And again, it's that closed-ended design of how you're supposed, that idea of reading something in the book and having that be how things are, it's not like that with artists. For me, adaptability is something that's so important, and it's something that I really am inspired by, especially like, people in South Asia. How do you adapt to those circumstances? Or like Bangladesh with climate, right? I was laughing with some people recently where like, people here think that, oh, Bangladesh and floods. But, floods is actually a season. So the way that you're Suhair or I'm Diana, there's a name in Bengali, which is Bonna, which means flood, which doesn't mean flood the way that the West would look at flood, right? Like, I was reading an article yesterday. So the next summit is going to deal with this idea of flood. It's not really about flood. It's more about like mistranslations. What does flood mean? But it talked about an area which has the highest rainfall in the world, which is in the northeast of India, actually near our sculpture park site in Sylhet. And it talks about like the place the British couldn't handle because there was too much rain. But the Katsi, the indigenous communities there, were building these living bridges, right? So they innovated ways to live on a land, because indigenous communities, like, your land is super important to you. It's not just any land, it's like that land. And so you have to be on it, you have to live on it, and you have to protect it. It's a different way of being with the world, right? Like in my culture, we become banyan trees when we die. And like we become parts of roots of banyan trees, and that's like where our ancestors live, right? So I probably can't tell you where I want to live when I grow up, but I can tell you where I want to die. So that, it's a different way of being. So anyway, I'm seeing this like in America. I think it's through artists and the kind of open-endedness.
You're somebody who relationships matter, and also borders do and don't. And I was actually listening to a conversation with you. I think it was the last Dhaka Art Summit, where you were talking about borders. So you've worked in Bangladesh and India, of course, the Philippines. And I think there was a Bangladeshi artist inspired by, Bangladeshi architecture, whatever else. But the interviewer asked you about borders and countries, and you said, well, I don't think we move from country to country. Countries move over people. And it just struck me when you were talking about your grandmother, this very like full circleness of why that is your vision. And it's something I personally really connect with. But I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that in your practice, being in Bombay, moving to Dhaka, and how that evolved.
Yeah, so I think it was, so also was an artist that's responsible for this. So Jitish Kalat, who's a fantastic artist in India, who also looks at these class divides and kind of, the struggles of that, of trying to make it in Bombay, or like how does a regular person not get eaten up by this machine much bigger than them? And he was in the collection of a young collector couple called Samdani, Nadia and Rajib Samdani. He was friends with them. They wanted to do something in Bangladesh, so I agreed to go visit. So I started this off as kind of being a guest curator. And again, I was mind blown. Like, it's a country where the prime minister, it's one of the longest histories of a female head of state in the world. The United States hasn't had a female head of state. Granted, she is the daughter of the founder of the country, but still, I think that says something. Highest female purchasing power in South Asia.
I was a curator before I came to India. I wasn't like, India didn't make me a curator, but I just didn't know the scale of what a curator could be, right? Like, there are certain curators that kind of take existing artworks, put them on a wall, and show them. That's what I did in New York. Now I don't do that ever. I mostly work with artworks that don't exist yet. So, which is a very different way of curating, because you're kind of this mix between a producer, a research assistant, a psychologist, a banker, you're kind of this whole thing. So in a way, the finance experience allowed people to trust me with money at a very young age, right? Or also to know how to build partnerships, right? So the summit, part of the way that the summit, and we'll get to that later, is so successful is we partner with people from all over the world. So while the nucleus of the funding and the energy is in Dhaka, it actually is running through these friendships and alliances. And since we're not for profit, whatever it's trying to build isn't money, it's something else. I wanted to blow away that idea that this was a nonprofit India Art Summit, because why would you have a nonprofit art fair? That makes absolutely no sense for anyone. So I worked on commissioning projects, would be the type of projects that maybe you wouldn't even see in a museum, because the kind of trust you would need to do something that risky would take years to get sign off on. right? So like one work, for example, is this incredible work, body of work by Shilpa Gupta. It travels in a lot of her exhibitions. So for example, it was just in Muka here in Antwerp, but she was looking at these things called chit mahals, which are pockets of India and Bangladesh, or were pockets of India in Bangladesh and pockets of Bangladesh in India. So these small, like kind of mini kingdoms that weren't traded during independence. So let's say that I'm here in this room. This room is Bangladesh and the rest of the apartment is India. So in this room, if I'm born in here, I don't get an ID card. So I can't go to school. I can't go to a hospital. But maybe I can like smoke marijuana because there's no police in here, right? Like, so what are these rules of like legal and non-legal? So also back in open-endedness and design. So like some women would take the name of someone in the apartment next door or in the room next door who's from India, so that the father is on paper Indian and the kid gets that passport or that documents, right? So she was looking at these really interesting lines between, what does it mean to be in a country inside another country? Just one day you wake up. So that Chit Mahal issue has since been solved, but she was traveling to these places. She wanted to make drawings with fencidil, which is a cough syrup that carries some kind of opioid inside. So it's illegal in India, but you can find it in these Chit Mahals. Kind of difficult for like a big museum to do, but kind of an amorphous art festival could support this kind of thing. Again, it was really difficult. Like, kudos to everyone who pulled this off. We had to have people hand carrying things from all over. Like, it's really a labor of love. And also stressful because the Dhaka Art Summit isn't a government venue, and we're looking at works that are pressing illegality, but it worked out. But the point is that I think the summit, we became this place where artists knew that they would have a context that maybe they didn't know before, could change the way that they look at their own world while connecting to it, change the way that our public in Bangladesh could connect to their own history, and also those works as they travel tell the story of Bangladesh in a different way than what you read in the newspaper. So when I talked about floods before, there was a project by Saiful Haq, which won an Aga Khan Award for architecture recently. It's an amphibious floating school made out of bamboo. I think it only cost $50,000 to build. So like, when it floods, it floats, it works. So I actually think the rest of the world can learn far more from, as we're all dealing, right? Look at the floods this summer, right? Like I was laughing with Nadia Samdani about like how in London restaurants were closing because it was flooding. Like in Bangladesh, you know it's coming, you have solutions. Like I'm a solutions oriented person, not a defeat. I'm not a victim and I'm not defeatist. And I think design is also a way where you're trying to find solutions or applying artistic thinking to world problems. So I should also say that maybe the first Bangladeshi I met that I registered as a Bangladeshi was Mohammed Yunus. Like as I was a young adult, and I was just blown away where he talked about what's the difference between a Girl Scout and a beggar. They're both asking you for money. One just has cookies. And that to me was like, oh, okay. Like, of course it's microfinance is far more complex than that. But as a premise, fascinating.
Well, I mean, I think you speak a lot through your work and through your curation about the idea of the postcolonial lens. And I know you've used words like neocolonialism in the past, also in conversations. And for me, that's really powerful and something that, I'm a product of American institutions. That's my education.
Both of us.
That's my entire career. I find it really interesting that, his words, Muhammad Yunus's words, resonated in your practice. And what you've really done is to create platforms to not just empower because you're benefiting back, but to create these loops and this kind of circular experience for communities, for artists, as well as for audiences who are really coming from all over the world. I mean, in the last summit, you had the director of MoMA, you had some of the most important people in the art world coming to visit to Dhaka. And as you said, you weren't sure yourself about moving. And I think you should own that and take, a lot of joy and pride in what you've done as somebody who's embedded yourself in that space. But I wonder if you feel that, you were able to also help because you came from the outside. How is it that you feel that your vision and voice connected with these families? Because it's very much a platform that you've built. And again, I'd be really curious about the vision overall and where that sits with you and how it's evolving over time.
Yeah, it's been wonderful because, we've been working together for such a long time and we are kind of like a family, like, families fight, families grow, it's a really wonderful thing. And like, it's also wonderful to watch them grow too, right? Because in 2012, we hadn't done all of these things. We hadn't had also all these collaborations. Like, you know, it was kind of incredible to have this show from Dhaka Art Summit 2018 open at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. And I think it was one of their highest attended shows in Poland. But just, you know, we've learned so much, but also we learned about what's important to us. So I think at the beginning, they really saw themselves as collectors. And now I think they see the collectors and maybe like sponsors, because they were sponsoring things here and there. Now we don't really sponsor things because we produce things, right? So we are producers that produce like kind of experiences, and we support artists along the way. Sometimes we collect work from that, but it's not really about the object. And now we're working on this permanent art space, which is a sculpture park and a residency space in the northeast of Bangladesh in Sylhet. But, you know, we're also trying to see how is that going to impact the community long term? How do we look at different kinds of communities? So like when I started talking about that rain story and the Kasi community and these living bridges that they're building, right? We want to work with these communities too. And we think that artists are a great way, because this quote, Olafur Eliasson told me this once, but like, what all human beings have in common is an ability to create and a desire for beauty. So again, what beauty is different across cultures, but that is something that makes us all human. Or another colleague, Jose Luis Blondet, who works at works at LACMA, brilliant curator, he was saying he came across this Jane Goodall quote that says, "What makes us human is that we share fictions." So I'm really interested in sharing these fictions. I'm really interested in the facts that are held in fictions, right? So maybe it was also this understanding that a farmer in Bengal and a farmer in Andhra Pradesh probably have more common with a farmer in Brazil than they do with like an elite Indian or an elite Bangladeshi. But there's no kind of flows of capital that are going to be bringing, or at least so far, like, so for example, there's always going to be funding for British artists to go to Bangladesh, right? There's the British Council, there's embassies, there are long-standing business relationships, like there's a machine there. But like, if I only look at these artists, like where those routes of exchange exist already, I'm shutting off so many other ways of understanding a place, right? And it was kind of amazing to be in Bangladesh with this Argentine artist, Adrian Villar-Rojas, who, you know, there are Argentine flags everywhere across Bangladesh. Why? Because Bangladeshis love soccer. So they absolutely love it. And for him, he was also kind of mind blown that like in Bangladesh, the patrons are Bangladeshi, like the British left. Like, you know, you don't really have rich British expats running things in Bangladesh anymore, or India to that regard. But when I was last in Argentina or in Mexico, like I go to like an art world gala, everyone is white. Like, yes, they are Mexican or Brazilian or Argentine, but like the upper classes are not, you know, they're white, and that's a problem, or you know, it's a challenge, right? And it's so I just started to see that actually there was so much that like artists from other parts of the world could learn from being in Bangladesh, and there were so many connected stories, but there's no soft power route to do that. And also with climate catastrophe, we are all connected, so you can't like we cannot look at things in regions. Some you know, it's geopolitics. Like we have a much more planetary view. So I knew that I needed to kind of hack into my funding to enable exchange that no one else was doing. My practice is very much thinking with artists. So I saw a piece in a research piece called The Seismography of Struggles, which was looking at the history of, anti-colonial struggle from the Haitian Revolution until 1989, but in non-Western journals. And it's done by an art historian named Dr. Zahia Rahmani. And so, but they're organized chronologically. So suddenly you see these kind of zines of places, of people that probably never met because it's chronological, but what they're fighting for is similar. So it was almost like a seismograph. So it was the first time I saw that word applied to people of this kind of, like this pushback against colonialism. And that to me was like, wow, this is fascinating, and more people need to see this. So of course there are journals from Bengal in there. It's incredible. It's a really fantastic project. But and then I was talking with Adrian, who has a piece with 400 million-year-old fossils, which we also showed in the summit, which again is a time when the world was a giant ocean. So when we talk about borders, like there wasn't even land at that point. So trying to just kind of blow up these kind of, again, boxes with how we were supposed to see time, see our place in the world, etc.
On this, I have a question, because you know this story of connecting, and I find that again really powerful. There's so much more in common between two people in two poorer countries than there would be in their lived experience to people in the developing versus developed world. And you're able to create this space that allows for those conversations. And you said, well, everybody could come and we could have that experience. How much do you think, technology actually helps people to see one another's visions or perspectives in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise? And how much do you think you're going to have to lean into that now going forward? And do you think, there's no replacement for being together in person, but do you think that it will allow you to scale your storytelling in some way?
Totally. So I need help of people like you or other, so this is something, for example, the summits, we never did Skype. We actually said you had to be there in person to present or you weren't presenting. It was like an in-person thing. And I think our social media, we have the largest like in-person following of a contemporary art show, but actually our social media, our website, like we're not really good with this digital stuff, but actually we realized that is something we need to work on. So as we're planning the next summit, which will open, we hope February 3rd, 2023, we are really going to, for us, it is that local visitor that comes in. That is who we do this for. But how do we make this hybrid? So rather than expecting people to travel from halfway across the world, I'm not even worried about people going to Bangladesh. I'm more worried about them going home. Like, I don't want to be responsible for anyone being stuck somewhere. But so how, or if people have been to Bangladesh before, how can they still engage with our content? So yes, I have to I think it can really amplify the storytelling. I think that it, can also, help the climate. It can, there's so much that can be done with these technologies. I just need to figure out that that's not one of my strengths. So it's about building a team that has those strengths to be able to do this. And I thought it was also very interesting when we had a conversation, Suhair, about Google and also about how many of the coders or Google and YouTube come from India and Bangladesh, right? So I think it could be really cool to build a team, like in the way that I build these curatorial teams, or now I'm trying to build art mediator teams from different countries. Like if we are the biggest kind of global laboratory for the first time art visitor, how can we almost like create this group of people who are innovating with these mediation tools and try them out in Dhaka and get feedback and try to implement them elsewhere? But yeah, I think with technology, I need to make a similar kind of team. And there's so much room here. And now, in a way, we are forced. Like before, we could kind of afford to ignore it. Like you come to Dhaka, you don't come to Dhaka. Now, no. Like, we have to switch the way that we work because otherwise it's, it's the logical next step.
Well, I actually think that there's a bigger conversation there around creating value for culture outside of this cultural space. So you've done that on the ground with communities, and you've created this incredible circular conversation between the people of Bangladesh, who are your primary target audience, and these artists and curators and experts from around the world. And I think, when you speak about the space of technology, or people sitting on the outside, they could provide the vehicle for a lot more connection, conversation, and immersion in culture, and they have to learn to value it in ways that, people like you can facilitate. But I want to move on actually to what you're working on now.
Yeah.
So I know you're working towards the next Dhaka Art Summit, and then you also have an upcoming show in Brazil, and I was hoping you could unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. So the show is, the English title is Wayward Lines, and the Portuguese title is Linhas Tortas, which kind of means crooked lines, wavy lines, and basically it comes from this Brazilian aphorism. Like, I used to speak some Brazilian Portuguese. I took it in college. I was looking at my transcripts. I got good grades, but now me and languages, it's not working so well anymore. But it's Deus escreve certo por linhas tortas. So like God writes straight with crooked lines, but metaphorically, God works in mysterious ways. So kind of like when I talked to you about like the story of my career, which like is really a very strange story with kind of recurring characters, certain characters that have a chapter and leave. But like, it's a big story of setting out with intention, but without knowing really where you're going or with an end in mind, right? It's not like the way that you have a goal and you have to achieve it and you have benchmarks. No, it's about I guess celebrating the complex trails of thought and life that unfold when you set off without the end in sight. Like you take paths that are not driven by expediency or efficiency, not optimized by supply and demand, and avoiding shortcuts that like capitalist and colonial forces put there, right? That benefit the few at the expense of the many. But also that thing like God writes. It's also questioning who has the right to write. right? So certain people, maybe their cultures were oral, right? Like Chamorro culture, mine, it's oral. Or certain indigenous cultures, they have different ways, or maybe they weren't considered, their stories weren't considered important enough to write down. Or maybe they were actively, books are actively burned or lines are like actively written out. Or even when we look at last names, right? The way that like it works, usually it carries the father, right? Like what are the matrilineal lines that might have been written out? So it's going to refute a straight line reading of the past and try to unearth like meandering lines that come together. So basically, it's also the context of the show is it's the 10th anniversary. Again, it's no longer the 10th anniversary, but it'll probably be around the 13th when it happens. It's in September 2022. But it's the anniversary of 10 years of Mendes Wood, which is a gallery that was born in Sao Paulo, but now has branches in New York and in Brussels also. And I've been friends with these guys like since kind of the beginning of my career. And actually, the European partner of Mendes Wood and I worked at Sotheby's together. So we were both actually a very important part of each other's lives and journeys. And so we thought rather than the kind of shows where you have to apologize for someone being your close friend or apologize for like putting your partner in the show, we want to celebrate that because these partnerships are part of what life is. And, I once gave a talk at the Courtauld about South Asian art history, and I was really embarrassed to say actually that, that question, how did you end up in South Asia? And I'm like, oh, well, it was for love. It's not a serious thing. And someone was like, no, actually that's the most serious thing. And I completely agree. So this show is actually going to celebrate those things, and it's going to be in multiple venues. It's not only going to be Mendes Wood artists, and we're going to look at basically these lines of solidarity that are bound by commitment, trust, and friendship, and this kind of intangible currency and radical charge that can radiate out in unimaginable directions. I'm also going to be curating the next Desert X, which is a biennial in the Coachella Valley. And interestingly enough, the indigenous name for Palm Springs meant boiling waters. And so I'm going to try to connect the aridity and the drought of the desert context with the flood and the it's not very articulate today, the too much water side of Bangladesh, right? Because basically it's how do you live with climate extremes. So I think everything is linked, and I also like the saying that you need something done, ask a busy person. So I've got quite a busy year. I also have a show that's going to open in Jakarta so basically the summit's February 2023, Desert X is March 2023, and then I have a show in Jakarta in April 2023. So it's going to be busy.
And what is that?
It's going to be a solo show of an Indonesian artist named Aditya Novali, who was also in the last Dhaka Art Summit. But he's also interested in looking at, so for example, in batik, where do these cloud forms come from? What are the stories? Where did they migrate from? So actually this interest in weather and weaving and patterns is very much, that's what I'm super fascinated with. So I'm really excited to work on this. And I think that's the other thing with geopolitics. It's like Indonesia and Bangladesh have so much in common with the kind of infrastructures with how they make art, their young population, lots in common, but you're not really seeing them together. Like, India and Bangladesh go in one corner because of South Asia, like Indonesia and Philippines go in another because it's Southeast Asia. But actually, why? Like it's so I really enjoy working on these kinds of projects that kind of rethink those lines.
I love that. So one of our guests on Open-Ended is actually he runs a boutique, high-end, very sort of heritage company in Jakarta. It's called Iwan Tirta. So I'll put you in touch
would
with
love
him.
To go.
And sort of exploring exactly that, the history of colonialism and obviously craft and capitalism through just, this one fabric is
it's
important, but also so interesting. And I really admire how you keep pushing outside of what feels comfortable too, because yes, you find the similarity, but also that must be quite scary in some ways and intimidating. And
well, for me, what's most scary is I have a show opening in China in 1 month in Nanjing, and it's the first show where I haven't been to the building, and it's a Stephen Hall building with oblique walls. And I'm waiting for the architectural model to arrive here. It's been stuck in customs for like 3 weeks. And so that I think is going to be the big challenge. So like it's one thing if I've been in the building before and I understand. So I'm someone, again, I'm analog. Like I need to see how the scale of like my being feels towards the work and everything else, right? But also with the summit, it's also the scale of other people. Like now I know after having 500,000 people in 9 days, I cannot curate the summits the way I did before because this mass is going, I mean, again, pandemic, we want to go back to that, but that's part of the space. So for that, for me, is what's very scary. Like Jakarta, I've been many times. I understand Jakarta. I grew up in California. I understand that. But this one's that's my yeah.
And something that is very resonant about your practice is that you go and you exist and you live.
Yeah.
You become family with your
Yeah,
collaborators.
totally.
And but that is a new challenge. Okay, so we're going to wrap up now, but I want to ask you, because we ask all of our guests for a call to action, and I'm curious about, from all of the breadth of what you're doing, what it would be.
I think the call to action is that we need to support the people making things. I mean, a lot of people have said this, but like, our common friend Imran Ahmed was saying, like, why should a t-shirt cost less than a sandwich? Right? Or like, I've also mentioned to you, like, I'm very interested in indigenous cultures, indigenous designs. My mother, for example, I would complain, like, why don't we have oceanic objects like at home? And she's like, look, it's not the object, it's the knowledge of how to make it that's important. And we have so many knowledges that will be lost if we don't support this. But also, when we buy from expensive companies, that those profits are not being shared with the people that make things. So I think we need to think about supporting people rather than companies, or supporting companies that support people. And like, we were talking about capitalism, all this thing, it's real. But like, we need to figure out how do we not just talk about like, not just talk about, indigenous issues, but how do we actually support and bring those people with us? It's really trendy in the art world to like, have indigenous artists, but like, do they get to travel? Do they get a budget? Like, I think this is also for me in my practice. And I think it's great with Documented too, where they're really looking at the economics of the show, trying to share resources, but yeah, to think about all of these things. And it's not easy, but it's important. So, eventually with our sculpture park, I would love to have a kind of design shop that treats the handiwork of talented people with the same value that we treat artwork. So they get half, and then the other half goes to supporting the infrastructure of the platform. But I think, it's important to think about these things and not have that divide, such a big divide between the genius and the person making it for the genius.
It's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And we're also really excited to see what happens with your residency in Select.
Yes. Looking forward. We want to have it open to architects, designers. Like, it's not just going to be for artists.
Right. And that's, another thing that I think is for another day is, but I think I should add it here because I think it's really important, is how you have always shifted from practice to practice, and you've worked a lot with the visual arts, but your interest now in design and architecture as a generative force to engage with climate and other natural disasters, I also find really powerful.
Yeah, I think we need to bring them together. Artistic thinking, right? Like, I would say that there's something artistic about how Mohammed Yunus was thinking about things. Like, or Sonam Wangchuk, right? That guy is an artist. Like, he's an engineer, but the guy is an artist. So I think that we need to kind of awaken that artist in these different fields and come together with the different. Yeah, it's almost like, actually back to Adrian, he was saying it was kind of like building a soccer team, right? Like, so how do we build the best team with the best knowledge and experiences because, it's not like a soccer game where one person wins, the other one loses. No, we all lose unless we fix this.
Totally. I mean, that's what I was saying about technology. We need a lot more of that spirit. But also we've seen that creative technologists are the ones who define themselves as artists and are able to work across disciplines in the most incredible ways because they have a freedom. And they've just given that to themselves. Nobody else has done it. And I think it's really powerful that you say that about other disciplines also. I will encourage everybody to go check out the website for the Dhaka Art Summit, follow them on Instagram, give their social media a boost, and also follow Diana and her stories because she's amazing. Thank you for listening. We welcome you to join and continue the conversation over on our Instagram at openended.design. You can also find us on LinkedIn at Openended Design and our website at www.openended.design.